Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CoachX Live, CoachX Conversations with the Institute of Coaching. My name is Jeff Hull. I'm the Executive Director with the Institute of Coaching, and I am very excited about today's topic. It is not lost on me as a baby boomer that one of the things that we're dealing with as we go into this great resignation that everyone is reading and writing about is that the workplace is going through huge upheaval. And there is an area of diversity. There's a lot of focus on diversity inclusion, but there is an area of diversity that does not get enough focus, and that is age diversity. So it is something that we at the Institute have been wanting to expand and explore and make more visible for our coaches for quite a long time. So I am really excited to have an expert on the subject in the house today. His name is Adrian Porter, and I'm going to jump in with him in a minute to discuss ways that coaches can be thinking about working more effectively with leaders in this very important area of age diversity. But I want to just take a shout out to say hi to everybody that's coming in. Say hello from wherever you are. We love to see the locations that people are coming in from. And while we do that, let me give you a little background on Adrian Porter. Adrian is a well-known keynote speaker. He's an age inclusion advocate and the founder of an organization called Mid-Career Mastery for coaching and planning for people at all ages. He's also the creator of a spotlight series on LinkedIn called Fabulous Over 40, and created and hosts another podcast, very highly rated podcast called Gen X Amplified. As a thought leader, he frequently speaks to organizations around the world and has developed signature frameworks for getting unstuck at different phases at mid-career, late career, and early career. He is an expert in the value of age diversity and how to build a powerful brand at any age. He's worked with many corporate clients, including Humana, the Executive Leadership Council, Hired Incorporated, the Atlantic Hawks, Thurgood Marshall College Fund, and many, many others. He's also been an executive at multiple companies, including HBO, Cartoon Network, Citibank, and was the CMO of a nonprofit in the media and tech space. So he is really an expert in this area of age diversity. And I just want to jump in and welcome you, Adrian. We had you last week for a wonderful webinar with the Institute, and we're really happy to have you back.
I am glad to be back, Jeff. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm happy and excited to spend more time with you for round two, and also the IOC Institute of Coaching community all over the world. My understanding that these particular CoachX conversations are widely watched and listened to internationally. And for those of you who aren't watching this live or on the replay, team replay, I'm excited to spend time with you as well.
Yeah, no, usually we get folks from all over. And so if you want to take a minute and let us know where you're from, and if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section. We'll try to get to some of them during our time together. So Adrian, let me start a little more of your personal story so that we can get a sense as coaches of how this came to be a topic that you've done so much research and writing about. So tell us, how did it come up in your own life to focus on age diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. So I always start when I'm asked this question, it came up because I am constantly aging like all of us. And so I wanted to really understand the nuances, but just to unpack it a little bit more specifically, how I became such a passionate advocate for inclusion, midlife and mid-careers through initially my own, I would say, midlife, mid-career malaise that I was experiencing in my early 40s. At the time, I, just moved to another city, still I was expanding my family, married, new house. I got laid off literally the year that I turned 40. And so that was a big moment for me in 2011. And so I got laid off and I was figuring out, well, what am I going to do? And I start to feel this point of inflection, if you will. And at the same time, I was always very passionate about the social sciences when it came to generations. I'm a proud advocate of Generation X, which is my generation. And so I've always, I was a nerd for that stuff. I loved reading about it. I read the books Generations by Bill Stroud and Neil Howe and became really obsessed with that. So which started my podcast. But as I started to move into more of my generational work and studies and amplification of the overlooked but very powerful generation like Gen X, between those brilliant boomers and magnificent millennials, as I always say, because it's all about bridging the gap.
Right.
I also wanted to understand, why was I feeling this sense of malaise? At the same time, when it came to age diversity, why did different people at different ages feel the sense of malaise, whether it's ageism, whether it's getting older? And so I just became fascinated, and then I just dedicated myself with this cause of ensuring that all of us across all ages and all generations really get a sense of momentum when it comes to having a meaningful life, personal growth. And I start to really understand, what was it that impacted us from a sense of the sense of malaise. And so I came across, which I'll unpack a little bit more, and I spoke about this a little bit in the webinar, but what was fascinating when it came to my own malaise in midlife and mid-career, that there is this natural phenomenon that happens when you're in your 40s, and it's called the U curve of happiness. And when I discovered this, it was eye-awakening. So let me just unpack that further, because based on documented research, which was initially spearheaded by a couple of labor economists, David Blanchflower and Andrew Oswald, out of Great Britain and the UK, respectively, I believe, both of them, they wanted to initially discover the impact or the relationship between unemployment and well-being. And so they did many studies across many countries. And in that study, they found that in your early adulthood life, you have a level of happiness that's self-reported based on studies that, let's say, starts here. But as you age from 18 through your 20s, through your 30s, your level of well-being, happiness, life work satisfaction tends to go down. And then it plummets and nadirs at this 40s and your 50s, right? A la the midlife crisis, as they say. But then as you age and get into your 60s and your 70s and your 80s, it goes back up and even gets higher than what it was during your early 18 and when you're 18. And so when I came across this data, I just dedicated myself to understanding it more, to researching it more, to understand why. Number one, this sense of malaise that I was feeling at the time was not unique to me, which was very satisfying to hear. But at the same time, I wanted to understand, how could we as a society minimize the misery and maximize the joy, if you will, upon each arc of that curve. So that's where my studies of midlife, mid-career mastery came into play. And then at the end of the day, I'm very passionate about DE&I. And in addition to the midlife age dynamics, I wanted to understand, how can we as a society really embrace age inclusion, age diversity across all ages. And so that was kind of a short way of me just letting you know, it started from a personal pain point, but at the same time, as I always say, when it comes to diversity, the one dimension of difference that we all share is that we all age. And so why this is very common, is not common when it comes to discussing this from a broader perspective.
Yeah, which is why I think it's so important that we are, right? It's like,
Yes.
it's part of what you are committed to and what I'm committed to as a boomer who's also aging,
Right.
is to learn what we can about this subject from a research standpoint, and to expand the visibility of and the impact of what we can do as coaches. And
Yes.
I was just noticing that articles recently in the Wall Street Journal
Yes.
about age and the fact that people are living longer, and that, the irony, especially in the US, but I think it's true in many parts of the world,
Right.
is that there's a need for people in the workplace. There's a lot more competition in the workplace, especially in
Yes.
knowledge workers. And folks, younger and older folks, are clamoring to get good jobs and to stay in the market or get
Right.
into the market. So it's really interesting to me. I mean, you're an example of someone who, as you said, is kind of in the Gen X, like in the lost middle, so to speak.
The lost
Um,
middle, yes.
the lost middle. But at the same time, you personally are representative of someone who's vocalizing and researching and writing about the importance of all ages being respected and utilized effectively. So
Yes.
what I want to do with you today is maybe go from one extreme to the other extreme on the two ends of the arc,
Got it.
because the article in the Wall Street Journal that I was reading talked about the fact that we need to find ways to overcome age discrimination for older folks, because older folks want to stay in the workplace and they have a lot of wisdom and knowledge,
Right.
and they're needed in today's workplace. So
Yes.
what can you offer to coaches who are thinking about helping leaders to have a broader mindset
Mm.
around bringing in the wisdom, keeping people working longer, having what are your thoughts in terms of um, overcoming age discrimination at the older side?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jeff. Well, first, I would encourage all coaches and all leaders in the world of work to first lead in with a sense of empathy. So, number one, understanding the landscape that we are in a world of work, a changing, ever changing world of work, where there are now 5 generations in the workforce. So let's just start there. Let's just start with the facts and the data, because to your point, we need to acknowledge there are older workers, 50, 40, 50 plus. You know, we say 40 plus because, believe it or not, age discrimination is really heightened even at age 40, especially
Right.
as we are in this tech-enabled society now. The Age Discrimination Act that was launched in 1967 protects workers 40 plus. So let's not lose sight of that. But also at the younger end, there's age discriminations as well. So number one, I would say we need to empathize and understand that we're in a society, especially in the world of work, where there are now 5 generations, all the way from the incoming fresh perspective of Gen Zs, all the way to those silent, believe it or not, even beyond the boomer, the silent generation or the traditionals. Because to your point, we're living longer now as a society. So in the past, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, if you were 65, you were pretty much going to retire. Now, because of the Great Recession, not that's externally, but internally, because we're living longer, you know, if we're 65 or 75, we don't necessarily want to retire. We want to stay in our jobs or any job adding value. So if you look at the landscape, we understand that as coaches, we have a tapestry of generations at our feet that have to work together to remain productive at work. So understand and be empathetic to what are the different nuances each generation has and what do they possess to that particular organization. And so I would say try to encourage some conversations, right? Just like we're having a conversation, boomer to Gen X, try to encourage a mutually beneficial conversation across all generations. And then also as coaches, I will encourage them to amplify the value of mutual mentorship, which I always talk about. So a lot of times when we think of mentorship in the workplace, we think older superior to incoming employee, right? But it goes both ways. So me as a Gen Xer, as a 40 plus professional, there's a lot that I can learn from a Gen Z or millennial. In the same sense, the younger generations can learn a lot from the older generations, whether it's soft skills, leadership, communication skills, team building. Not to say that Gen Zs or millennials, they don't possess those skills, but those skills a lot of times are grown and cultivated through age and experience. But at the same time, the older generations can learn a lot from the younger generations when it comes to the new technologies of the world, how to properly use TikTok or what have you. That's just an example. So again, I would just encourage conversations, be empathetic, and just understand what is it about these particular across all ages that make them tick and give them value and purpose, those employees, if you will.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Empathy is
Mhm.
where it starts, right?
Yes.
Listening and curiosity. And
Yes.
I just want to acknowledge Marilyn in our audience has pointed out that it's the language that we use that's also
Yes.
really crucial. And even I use that term older, and we
Yes.
use the term elder, and we use these various terms. So thank you,
Right.
Marilyn. I think there's something for us to think about as coaches
Yes.
when we are engaged in the conversations of power and the meaning behind some of the terminology that we use. And it probably goes
Yes.
both ways, right? So you say, oh, you're
Yes.
so young, or oh, you're older. And so it's like, what is implied in that language? And I'm thinking, what is the right language? Are there
Yeah.
better ways to phrase things, Adrian?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And my background in marketing and communications, I try to pay attention to that as much as possible. And I'm guilty of it as well. But what I try to be a little bit more intentional. So for example, when you hear me talk about generations or age diversity or specific cohorts, I try to use certain terminologies like fabulous over 40. When I refer to 40 plus, I say seasoned or experienced as opposed to older. I'm always, when I talk about the Gen Zs or the incoming employees, I talk about fresh perspectives, right? Those
Yeah.
those little nuances of language can mean a lot. So fresh perspectives, seasoned employees, emerging employees, emerging perspectives. When I talk about Gen X Amplified, I always say the powerful generation. Yes, me in my role, I am amplifying the power of my forgotten, overlooked generation. But I do say between the brilliant boomers and the magnificent millennials. So it's not about bashing; it's about building up a tall building without tearing down other buildings. And that's
That was
so that's a great point Marilyn brought up. So it's just all about the language we use.
Yeah, and it's funny because my last guest on LinkedIn Live, my good friend Hae Sun Moon, just wrote a
Mm,
book about the linguistic core of conversations called Coaching
yes,
from A
yes,
to Z. And
yes.
her main theme was that just the slight linguistic shift can be
Mm,
so powerful in
very
creating
powerful.
optimism or positive energy. And so I love some of the language that you're using. And I'm thinking now, if we switch gears, because we could
Okay.
talk for an hour about the older or the season, but let's go to the
Yes.
younger.
Okay.
And
Let's.
because I love also the issue is that so many of the boomers, and this will sound somewhat stereotypical, but I've seen this in my clients. So
Hmm.
just from personal experience, many boomer executives have challenges with millennials or Gen Zs. They have a complaint about them not working as hard or whatever stereotypes.
Right.
So, what are your suggestions for bridging those gaps
Mm.
between, let's say, the boomer and the millennial, or I hate to use older and younger, but we're talking about age.
Yeah, no, it's a great. Well, I say, and we just talked about language and use of words. I would be honest with there. And let me take a step back. So I do believe, and even when in the conversations about generations, because I do get many times the counter argument, which can be valid, which is valid, that why do we even have to group people in generations, and aren't we all different? And so I would say this is that I do think that there's validation in the time that you came of age does shape some of your perspectives when it comes to how you approach work, how you approach life. If you came of age during a time where it was pre-internet, pre-Google, pre-smartphone, pre-iPhone, and you went to work and it was a fax machine or it was all about memos, then you may have a different perspective. And so I do think, and the reason I'm tying that together is because when it comes to the younger generation, like the Gen Zs, we do have to acknowledge that the way that they came of age, and many of them were by Gen Xers. So typically, the Gen X children are the Gen Zs, millennials are boomers, and some majority of the time. But anyway, they do come into the workforce with a different perspectives and expectations. It's just natural. So as a boomer or a Gen Xer, or even someone that's in a traditional generation, they may have to interact with Gen Zs. You have to understand that they do come to the table with certain expectations. Now, the question is, what do we do with that expectations? Do we acknowledge them and try to make it a productive working relationship, or do we just totally dismiss them? Obviously, you need to acknowledge them. So maybe Gen Zs are coming to the table, or even a millennial, with this idea that, I want to be coached every day, or I have an expectation that if I do my job great for 3 months and I'm going to get promoted to become VP in a year. Now, that may be unrealistic. And again, though that may be a stereotypical characterization, but I've worked with millennials before, and a lot of times there is a sense of rigor and acceleration of expectation when it comes to being promoted. Now, Is that wrong? I'm not going to say it's wrong, and it's probably not wrong, but that's their expectation. So you, as a seasoned boomer and experienced Gen Xer, someone that has been on both sides of the technology equation or leadership equation, maybe you can coach them to say, "Hey, I appreciate your passion to want to add more value in a different role. Let's talk about a plan to get you there. You may not be ready yet." So it's all about those subtle soft skills, and but it starts with number one, empathy. And embracing the expectation, but then figuring out a way to make sure you still add value to that passionate go-getter of a younger generation, but at the same time be able to encourage them. So I just say it starts with empathy and just really acknowledging, maybe their expectations were shaped by how they were raised.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think one of the things I've seen that really progressive client organizations do that bridges this gap is use reverse mentoring. And I know you've
Yes.
spoken about that, and I wrote about that in my book. And I'm
Yes.
curious if you have any suggestions for companies that would be open to considering, or leaders that would be open to considering reverse mentoring. What do you suggest for coaches to bring that to the table for them to actually flip the classroom, so to speak, so that there is mentoring going in both directions, coaching and mentoring going in both directions?
Yes, I love this question because a lot of times, if there are organizations, and I do encourage all organizations, if you want to remain productive, to embrace some sort of idea of reverse mentoring. As coaches, your skill set, your bread and butter is all about transforming personal and professional growth. It's about getting the best out of that individual. So I would encourage coaches to look at some of your tools and frameworks and your methods of how you would encourage or highlight certain skill sets of any individual and bring that to a broad perspective to an organization. For example, if you go to an organization and they want to embrace a reverse or mutual mentorship program, then you can come to them to say, "Hey, well, first, what we do is that we gather, or for lack of a better word, put in communities people based on their job levels or their ages, and try to pull out some of those value added skill sets that they embrace, right? That the same goes to the older generation, and then look at the gaps. And so maybe encourage from the beginning, pull out those skill sets, pull out those transferable skills and those superpowers of the Gen Zs and the emerging employees, and at the same time pull out the superpowers of these seasoned generations and employees, and then look at the gaps, and then figure out a cohesive, productive way of putting that together in sort of program. And so I would say it starts with pulling out what are the areas that could add even more value. For example, I mentioned this earlier, whether it's leadership or team building. Obviously, I do believe that, with age comes some sort of a skill when it comes to being able to navigate the different waters, or different teams. And so maybe from the seasoned employees, those are some of those superpowers. And then for the younger employees, be able to call out and bring out some of the skill set that they may have. For example, being on top of all the changing technologies, having new ideas, fresh perspectives. And then as a coach, your job is to orchestrate as a conductor. All right, let's see how that we can coalesce this together and fill in some of those gaps. So I would say just use your skill as a coach, being able to pull out the best of who anyone is and adapt that to the generational or age level.
Beautifully said. Yeah, the example that I always give is to use the work. There's a wonderful book by Marcus Buckingham called the Nine Myths of Work, or something like
Yes,
that.
yes,
And he
Marcus. Yes,
talks about
Mr. Standout. Yes,
yeah, and he talks
yes,
about spikes. And
yes.
one of the things I did with a group with a client team is there were all different ages, and in fact, different backgrounds altogether,
Hmm.
different cultures, different races, genders, is I had them go around the room and do a spike conversation. And they
Mm,
had to each point out their individual spikes, like what they meant. And what is meant by a spike is your unique talent,
right.
like what makes you special.
Yes.
Also strengths, but it's like if you had to put it into words, something that you think of yourself or someone else that you work with that does particularly well. And so I had them write all the spikes on a flip chart and then
Yes.
decide how they were going to mentor each other all across different demographics and functions and ages so that they would learn about each other's spikes. And it was such a fun conversation
Yes.
because everybody realizes they all have spikes. And I think that's your point, right?
Yes.
Is to
Yes.
leverage those wonderful skills that people have at every age.
Yeah, I was going to say too, and we talked a little bit about this during the webinar, is, even for me, when I coach clients, do executive coaching, and I also do workshops on the framework I created formerly called the Malaise to Mastery Map, which essentially breaks down 3 key pillars or behavioral pillars for getting unstressed and unstuck at any age, particularly in those middle years, but in any situation. When I'm coaching clients on when they are stuck or stressed, whether it's in their own mid-career, mid-life malaise that they're experiencing, or if they're stuck in a situation, I go through these 3 pillars. Number 1, mindset; 2, meaning; and then thirdly, milestones. And so I encourage people to bring that type of framework to this particular situation. So number 1, get those individuals in across multiple ages to understand, number 1, what is the mindset? How can we reframe our mindset of how we approach that other generation? How can we reframe our mindset? How do we think about perspectives of a Gen Z or millennial, that they're not all lazy or too aggressive? So reframing, having a growth mindset. And then we get to the meaning, and what are we trying to achieve? What is the purpose? What is that path forward? And then we establish some micro and macro milestones. This is where the rubber meets the road. And so this is what I call the Malaise to Mastery Map, and looking at those 3 behavioral pillars, and not just codified. I mean, those are really best practices that we all have heard of and we employ, but I wanted to just codify them in a very simple but very productive and actionable model, if you will. And so I would encourage people to think about reframing, resetting. I always say you have to get rid of the clutter before you can gain clarity. So that's where mindset comes into play. And then looking at your meaning, how can we achieve our purpose and our why, what we're trying to achieve at this organization, and then establish those milestones that you can then celebrate and achieve.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I love this 3-stage framework that you talked about in detail in the webinar. And I would encourage folks to go to the instituteofcoaching.org website, where you can see the recording of the framework in more detail. So we only have a couple more minutes because these things fly by.
That's fast.
But I'm going to ask you a final kind of tough question.
All right.
So
am I ready?
Yeah. So you're a coach.
Okay.
And you're coaching an executive. It could be at any age.
Okay. Got it.
And that individual is exhibiting some unconscious bias about age. You pick up on it as a coach.
Okay. Got it.
What would you do?
Great question. That is a tough one. So the first thing I would do is listen. I mean, I've heard, but there's a difference between hearing and listening. And so I heard and witnessed the unconscious bias. So I would then approach that particular client or individual and just try to listen again to get to the undercurrent of what motivated that type of bias action, and then try to just take a step back and to understand, based on the motivation, why did they craft that particular perspective or opinion, and then what motivated them to exert that particular action. And so it's really just try to understand, and then I would come back with some data and some facts and just some conversation, more importantly, to try to get them to move away from that. And I believe that if I'm able to go to them with some documented truths and just some empathy, and hopefully I can then transform that feeling from bias to something that's a little bit more embracing of that other generation. So
that's great. Yeah, it's a tough question, and so I put you on the spot there.
It's a great question.
But I think that's what we as coaches often find ourselves is in a situation where, we have a boomer who is really not excited about hiring a Gen Z or a millennial because they have a narrative about it.
Yes.
Or we have a up-and-coming millennial young executive who is complaining about a boss. And so as coaches, we have to be listening, as you said, at a deeper level. And I love the idea of getting to the underlying driving narrative, the motivation, so that we're not judging. We're curious. We're empathizing. Recognizing that people have the best intentions, but they bring their story. So getting to know what is that story, and then asking for with ways to expand
Yes.
and perhaps get past that bias point. So thank you for
Yes.
that. I know I put you on the spot there.
No, it was great, but I love the exercise. Well, you're a coach, that's what you do. So, but
That's true.
I love the exercise because it got me thinking. I just went back into my toolbox and look at some of my approaches, and so, and then I even after I answered the question, I looked at ways for me. How could I, perfect it, or for lack of a better word, or make it better. Any approach, and you also have to be flexible, which is a word I'm sure you're definitely familiar with. Flexible in different situations, because not everyone may not have the same unconscious bias. And I always say too, when it comes to age, only based on data, only 8% of diversity and inclusion initiatives worldwide include age. So, which is very unfortunate. But when it comes to age diversity, I always try to amplify that if you remove or replace a lot of the terminologies that we use, okay, boomer, older, you're getting too old, with something that was based on gender or race, we would be very shocked at ourselves. And so we have to have the same rigor and vigor when it comes to age, which everyone, if we're blessed with that gift, will age. And so we're either approaching the bottom of the U curve, we're in the U curve, or we're coming out of it. And so we're all along that track as we age. So we all have a vested interest in how we, tear down the barriers and really try to coalesce all of us when it comes to all ages.
Well said. Yeah, and it's really great of you to take time and to be focused on this issue, because the most important thing of all, I think, for us as coaches is to raise the visibility of this form of discrimination so that we can truly work toward a more diverse and inclusive work environment for everyone. So
yes,
I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with the Institute of Coaching twice in 2 weeks. Encourage everyone to go to our website and check out the more detailed information that Adrian shared in the website, in the webinar, and look up Mid-Career Mastery and look up his podcasts, track him. He's writing a book that will be hopefully a huge resource for us as coaches.
Oh, wow.
So thanks again, Adrian. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Jeff. It was my pleasure and my honor.
And we'll see you